All right, so this chapter by Stephen Levick, chapter 6, Were it physically safe, human reproductive cloning would not be acceptable, starts off with a quick mention of the 2002 case where a Clonade scientist claimed that a human clone baby named Eve had been born, but it became clear pretty soon that the whole thing was a hoax. Still, the prospect of cloning raises questions about the welfare, the psychological welfare of the individual child who is, let's say, a clone. Now, would it be morally acceptable to try to establish the premise of safety? Answering this question, Decker says, is involving answering the following one. Is any good claimed for human reproductive cloning worth the physical risks it may pose? Now, in his view, assessing the relative physical safety of human reproductive cloning should not even be attempted before we also consider possible psychological, social, and societal risks that it may pose. In this article, he hopes to demonstrate that aside from whatever risks of physical harm human reproductive cloning might pose, it's reasonable to believe that the practice may well present sufficient risk of psychological or social or societal harms that it should not be acceptable. Okay, so throughout this article, he considers some of the points already raised in the article by De Volder. So De Volder looks at possible motivations of a prospective parent or parents to have a child by cloning. De Volder looked at 4 motivations that emphasize the well-being of the parent and 2 motivations that emphasize the well-being of the clone. However, the writing by Levick is going to show how certain existing situations and phenomena are like analogies to one or more aspects of cloning. And the analogs, or these analogies, can inform our thinking, Levick believes, about the cloning situation by drawing parallels to situations with which we're already familiar. And by doing this, they can help the human reproductive cloning situation seem less hypothetical and abstract. Okay, so the strength of the case in this article depends partly on the strength of these different analogies. Each analog has its own strengths and weaknesses, he admits, but taken together, they point to some of the same conclusions from different directions. So there's 5 analogs that we're going to look at below. First analog is the identical twin analog. The strength here lies in the fact that twins are true genetic clones of one another by embryo splitting. The weakness of the analog is that they exist at the same time and have the same age, identical twins, that is. Now, biologically, the twinning analog is useful partly for this reason. It's unclear what De Volder might be implying by saying that a clone could make better informed reproductive decisions, like avoiding bringing a child into the world with a serious genetic disorder. Okay, a second analog is the artificial reproductive technology, or ART analog. Now, in this regard, sexually infertile heterosexual couples would be joined by the intrinsically infertile, same-sex couples and sole individuals. And in terms of sexual reproduction, all humans are intrinsically infertile as solo. Now, some existing artificial reproductive technologies, such as donor insemination and ovum donation, produce children related genetically to only one rearing parent. Now, other kinds of ART have only one rearing parent being a genetic parent to the child. It's important to note, Lecker says, that even if overcoming sexual infertility were the conscious motive to pursue human reproductive cloning, other motives are also likely to be present. Okay, a third analog is what's called the adopted child analog. A non-related adopted child. All right, let's return to the adopted child analog. A non-related adopted child is not at all linked genetically to her rearing parents, making adoption, in a sense, the conceptual opposite of cloning, as Lecker notes. But this status makes it relevant by analogy to certain aspects of reproductive cloning. In particular, one way in which cloning and adoption are conceptual opposites is this. Though the adoptee often knows too little about his or her origins, the clone could know far too much. Now what's going on here is that just knowing that you're a clone of your parent might make it more difficult for you to have your personal identity, according to Lecker. Here's an example. A child clone told that her genes and mommy's are the same would be inclined to think of herself and progenitor mother as the same person, based on their identical genes. This and much more would put the child at risk for what's been called a foreclosed identity. Now, interestingly, Lecker says even if he were never told of his clonal status, a clone might still ineffably sense the template of parental expectations projected onto him. Okay, so another case, let me back up just a second here. Another case, I'm going to skip that large paragraph, and imagine this. A clone adoptee would not be an oxymoron, like having someone adopted who is a clone. And the adopted child analog would be doubly relevant to that situation. Let me look at this paragraph. Since adoption is acceptable, despite the problems that may be associated with it, why not human reproductive cloning too? His answer is that the crucial difference in the situations underlying the difference in moral judgment is this. The practice of adoption is justified by the need to provide parental care for children whose own parents were unable or unwilling to care for them. These children already exist, and there will surely be many more in the future. In contrast, the parental motivations for human reproductive cloning that the other author construes to be of benefit to a future child clone pale in moral significance to those justifying adoption. The idea is the children to be adopted are already around. The children who might be cloned are not yet around, and that's supposed to make a big difference. Okay, another analog is the parent-child resemblance analog. Lecker says, unfortunately, the wish for parent-child resemblance becomes an insistent demand in the pathologically narcissistic parent. The prospect of a mini-me that he could mold into his imagined ideal self would be irresistible. And the other author, De Volder, considers the pathologically narcissistic motive for parenthood by self-cloning to be among those motives she labels dubious. It's not that likely that people are going to want to have a clone kid just because they're narcissists. However, Lecker wants to reply to this, and part of the reply is this. Even if narcissism were only a minor motivating factor for self-cloning, that could change after the child is born, even for a relatively self-aware progenitor parent. Okay? Finally, the replacement child analog. The concept of a replacement child can be more generally applied to any situation in which a child is viewed by a parent as a stand-in a sense, for a dead child other than the one of their own, such as a parental sibling or a childhood friend. Life appearance of a child sexually conceived expressly to try to replace a dead child, adults wanting to clone for the same purpose are bound to be disappointed in their results. There's a process that Lecker talks about called transference, a phenomenon called transference, which refers to the transferring onto a person currently in an individual's life feelings, thoughts, and patterns of behavior that were typically first experienced with significant figures in the person's childhood. Transference, Lecker says, is universal and to some degree is part of every relationship to some degree, but transference can also overshadow the reality of the other person, unduly and detrimentally playing out in the current relationship. Interestingly, Lecker says, I doubt that simply educating the progenitor parent would do enough to prevent complex adverse consequences for the child clone. However, augmenting such education with insight-oriented psychotherapy might help such a parent sufficiently to relatively spare the child much harm. The other author, De Volder, appears to conflate high parental expectations with highly specific expectations. Lecker says, although high parental expectations can be beneficial, when such high expectations are not only high, but also very specific, negative consequences for the child are not unusual. What about the complaint that cloning is unnatural? Well, on the one hand, Lecker agrees in being unconvinced by the usual arguments against cloning because of them being unnatural. However, Lecker says there are serious, scientifically grounded notions of the natural that deserve our attention. One of them is this: though prospective parents through human reproductive cloning might find the genetic certainty of asexual reproduction comforting, the evolution of our species requires the combination and recombination of genes in sexual reproduction. So, interestingly, the evolution of a sexually reproducing species would grind to a halt if it just switched completely to an asexual reproduction. As he sees it, Lecker says, there is a slippery slope with cloning, but not so much from the therapeutic to the reproductive. Rather, looking at human reproductive cloning as acceptable would put one on a slippery slope to finding it preferable to sexual reproduction. Edward Wilson gave an opinion long ago that biological constraints exist that define zones of improbable or forbidden access in the future direction of human history, and perhaps cloning could fall into that. What about using human reproductive cloning as a means? Lecker talks about how the other author, De Volder, persuasively argues that creating a child for instrumental reasons is not problematic if the child is also valued in his or her own right. Beyond autonomy, the commonly held fear that the human clone would be without individual identity or autonomy intrinsically is unfounded. And what about social prejudice and respect? Though he strongly opposes human reproductive cloning, Lecker thinks criminalizing it would put a risk to pushing it underground and engendering prejudice towards clones. Lecker doesn't really consider the risk that clones could face social discrimination to be a reason to oppose human reproductive cloning. Still, anticipating this possibility should not risk intellectual opprobrium, which basically means you shouldn't say that bringing up the possibility of discrimination against clones is the moral equivalent of actually committing a kind of discrimination, like racism or sexism. All right. In conclusion, the different analogs that were brought up by Lecker are the centerpiece of his case against human cloning.